Last lesson, we introduced you to some of the concepts involved in the basic select statement. And in this lesson, we're just going to expand upon some of those and introduce you to a few new topics still related to those basic select statements. So you'll see this is the last query that we ended the prior lesson with. So one of the things you may ask yourself as we went through the last lesson was, what if I want to see every single column in the table? So I want to see all rows and all columns. Well, with what we've learned so far, you might say, well, let me just do this. Let me type out every single column name. So here are all the columns for person.person. So we have business entity ID, and I'm going to make my life easier by putting in the from clause so I can have the IntelliSense work to my advantage. So business entity ID, person type, name style, title, go to a new line to make it easier to read, first name, middle name, last name, suffix, email promotion, and all these other columns. Now I can execute this query, and I have a lot of columns here, and all 19,972 rows that are in this table. Well, that seems like a lot of work. It seems like a lot of typing. Is there an easier way to just get everything from a table? And the answer is yes. And it's using something called select star, is usually the way that we say it, where we type select and use this asterisk from the table that we want. So the asterisk is saying, show me all columns. And since we don't have the top operator, we're not restricting the number of rows that we return. So if I press execute now, I have all columns and all rows. So the select star is a nice little feature, but again, we don't want to return every single row of larger tables because it slows down performance and sucks up a lot of server or computer resources. It's just not good practice. What I do recommend, though, especially when you're working in tables that you're not familiar with, is to use the top operator in conjunction with the asterisk or the select star. So let's just go to a new table. Let's look at production.product. And suppose we know nothing about it, we don't know how big it is, and we don't want to take any risks of just hammering our server with a resource-intensive query. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to type select top 100, so I just return the top 100 rows, but I'm going to say star or asterisk, so I want to see all columns for those top 100 rows from what table? Production.product. And I press execute, and now here are the top 100 rows from this table and all of the column details. And if I go down to production.product in here, and I expand the columns folder, you could check on your own if you'd like and ensure that every column is returned to the panel, the results panel, which it is. So select star is something that's really, really nice. It's really helpful, and especially when you're working with databases that you're not familiar with or tables that you're not familiar with, it's a good way to just take a look at the data quickly without hurting the server's performance and impacting, say, other people's ability to query. So the last thing that I want to talk about in this lesson, and really the last thing I want to talk about with that involves basic select statements, is something called the column alias. Now, if we go back to the person.person table, you'll notice that most of these column names have no spaces. And in fact, that's usually what you see in databases and tables. Rarely is it a good practice to have spaces in your column or database names. It adds complexities, which we'll touch on in another section or another lesson. But more often than not, you'll see there's either no spaces or there's an underscore in place of where a space might usually be. Okay. So with SQL, we're usually returning data from a database to potentially deliver to business users. As a business user, I don't want to see first name without a space or middle name without a space or something like that that's not really easily read. It's not necessarily the cleanest way of looking at the column name. So column aliases give us a way to change the name of the column as it appears in the results panel. Now it's worth noting that this does not change the name of the column in the actual database, or I'm sorry, in the actual table. It's just how we see that column in this results panel. That's all we change. Now let's take a look at that. So let's just say I want to select the first 100 first name and last names from person.person. Oops. There we go. Okay. But let's say that I'm a business user and look, I don't want to see first name or last name. I want to see customer first name, or I want to see customer last name, or I want to see something that's a little bit cleaner. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to say first name and then type this as operator, which you'll notice turns blue. And anytime we want to use a column alias or give something a different name that has a space in it, we're going to put the square brackets around it. So I'm going to do this. We're going to call this column customer first name, and I'm going to have a closing bracket. And we're going to leave the last name column as is for now. And let's just take a look at what this looks like in the results panel. You'll notice that this no longer says first name without a space, but customer first name with spaces. Now, it's really important that you are aware that these square brackets have been used. If I try to execute this query without the square brackets, it has no idea what's going on. SQL does not like spaces in columns unless you have square brackets around them. It's the only way SQL knows that you're still talking about a column alias. Let's do the same thing for last name. So let's give this the alias customer last name, again enclosing it in square brackets. And when I execute the query, you'll see that both columns now have a column alias specified. If you want, and this is a matter of personal preference, you can replace the square brackets with quotation marks. That also works. Okay. So I said in the literal select statement, one of the literal select statement tutorials, that the presence of a string was indicated by a single quote and not a quotation mark. Well, in SQL, the quotation mark is used for indicating columns or column aliases with spaces in their names. So you can use a quotation symbol or the square bracket to handle column aliases with spaces. That's a completely personal preference. I use square brackets, but that's just because that's what I learned first and for no other reason. So that's all that we have in this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to talk about how we can use a basic select statement, but instead of querying a table, we're going to query something called a view, which we'll explain then.